Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I continue on with my series discussing whether or not Christie novels would work if they were set in 2025. And today I will be discussing the standalones, the non-Poirot, non-Marples. These are everything from the adventure thrillers to the Tommy and Tuppences and all the rest, except for And Then There Were None, which has its own video already out. And I love this exercise so much. These are a lot of fun to speculate, and I hope you all enjoy these as well. And just as a reminder here, there are spoilers ahead, but you can use the chapter titles to skip over novels you don't want to be spoiled. And I will consider a novel doable in 2025 if the basic plot structure is still possible today. Now, some things may not work exactly, but as long as it doesn't affect the overall novel, I will consider it workable. And before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. And I will go in publication order, starting out with The Secret Adversary, the very first Tommy and Tuppence novel. And this is a yes. I think this works. And just straight up for the rest of the video, I think most of the adventure thrillers are going to be yeses because I just find most of them to be just totally ridiculous to begin with. Like, the shift in time doesn't really matter for the mechanics, as many of them are hard to swallow to begin with, and these are not necessarily so grounded in reality to begin with. You know, with these Christie adventures, they're meant to be more fun and entertaining and diverting than her carefully planning out plot mechanics. Now, The Secret Adversary is actually one of the few thrillers that is grounded and believable, but I think it still works for the most part. Now, the obvious thing here that has to change is the World War I stuff. We're now in 2025, over 100 years after World War I. The sinking of the Lusitania is just not relevant here. There are no Bolshevik revolutions going on. So I think what has to be done here is to simply make this book about the war in Ukraine. That is the war that's currently going on. I mean, there are others, but that's the big one in Europe. And, Tommy and Tuppence could have done intelligence work, previously in Iraq and Afghanistan. They are a little bit young for that, however. They're only 21 or 22 here, but I also think their financial situation is probably a little bit different. I mean, there are all kinds of programs for someone like Tommy to use if he had been in Afghanistan, or even Tuppence now. We have females on the front lines now. I think for the sake of keeping the characters the same, I think it just works better if they didn't have that intelligence background. They just sort of stumble across the adventure like they do in the actual novel. Now, I think the plot works regarding, the war in Ukraine. Jane Finn could be a Ukrainian who fled Ukraine. Instead of her having this treaty, she has a crucial piece of intelligence. And because this is a thriller, I think we can suspend quite a bit of credibility here as to why she would be handed this information. Obviously, she would have a different name, and Julius Hersheimer can be very similar. Mr. Brown could be a Putin ally who wants to stop this information from getting out there. That would make Sir James Peel Edgerton a Putin ally. Perhaps he's an MP. And I think the plot can largely play out as normal from there onward. I guess Albert has to be a little different. They don't have elevator boys anymore in apartment buildings, but that just doesn't happen. But I think the telegram mix-up that Tommy reads that misspells Tuppence could be an email if someone steals Tuppence's phone. I think this would work. This plot does work. I don't see anything that prevents The Secret Adversary from working in 2025. It probably has a much different feel to it, but again, it's a thriller, so that's not really that important to me. Next, onto The Man in the Brown Suit, another adventure thriller that I think works in 2025. Now, this one does get a bit more complicated. I mean, first of all, I think a woman like Anne Bedingfeld probably doesn't struggle to find a job in 2025, but maybe she does, or maybe she's just bored by the prospect of some dead-end job. I think more likely is that she does get that reporter position, and she just spends more of the novel working than just following her whims or whatever. But I think the murder in the train station is a bit iffy. I mean, I think there could be cameras there, or certainly passengers with camera phones, although many of you have told me I am severely overestimating how many cameras are out there, especially in train stations, so maybe not. And the murder at Mill House also is a bit more complicated, but I wouldn't say impossible. Like, I do think the way like real estate is handled nowadays may complicate like renting out the house in the way the mechanics allow the murder to happen, but I don't think it's anything that can't be worked around. I think the stuff aboard the Kilmornan Castle remains largely the same. Now, I'm not sure if like hiding diamonds in film canisters is that feasible anymore. I mean, there are people out there who still use, film in their cameras, so I guess maybe. And I think the sensationalism of this crime in the book is so well suited for 2025. I think the parts set in Africa are fine as is. I know these areas were under British control in 1924 and aren't now, but I don't think any of that matters considering the events that unfold in Africa. Now, I think the biggest issue for this book is the backstory of Harry Rayburn and John Eardsley. I think it's perfect for the 1920s, not so much for the 2020s, but I don't think that matters too much. Again, the other issue is the travel of Sir Eustace and Guy Paget, because part of the suspense is that they claim to be in different countries than they really were at certain times, and I think that's just more easily checked up on. It doesn't really matter for Guy Paget, but it does for Sir Eustace, and I think the ending is just very strange. I don't think that Anne Bedingfeld of 2025 is really all that into Harry here, who lives like Tarzan in the African jungle. But again, that could easily be changed. So I do think The Man in the Brown Suit works in 2025. Onto The Secret of Chimneys, my very favorite novel. I guess this works. I mean, to be honest, I really don't like this book. It's my least favorite Christie novel and the one I know the least. But I guess this does work because it's not very realistic to begin with. I think the Herzo-Slovakian background story stuff is a little weird in 2025. I mean, it's not like there aren't like defunct royal houses out there of Eastern Europe, but I just think the storyline isn't as impactful in 2025. I guess it still works. We also have a bunch of like hijinksy jewel theft stuff of the Koh-i-Noor, which is a real life diamond, and this is just really ridiculous to believe. But again, it still works, and that's sort of my opinion of this book. For the context of this video, everything from like the theft, the background story, the murder, it all works, even if it's not particularly credible or even likely. But the shift in time still allows it to happen, even if it's a bit old fashioned, just because it's not very credible to begin with. Onto the sequel to The Secret of Chimneys, the much better Seven Dials mystery. And I think this one works. I do find the idea of a secret society of do-gooders dressing up with clock face masks in 2025 to be hilarious, but I mean, people do all kinds of weird things. I also find the use of analog clocks in 2025 to be also be kind of funny, but the mechanics wise, I think this all still works. Now, I think the young adults probably could just like Airbnb their own house somewhere instead of having to stay at Chimneys. But I mean, I think the joke of the alarm clocks works. I think the existence of the Seven Dials still works. I think the murders of Jerry Wade and Ronnie Devereaux work the same. There really isn't a lot of things like affected by the change in time period. However, I do think the overall plot sort of needs to be changed a little bit here. The important invention plans of a new type of steel, I mean, almost a century later, these plans need to be something more important, something that meets the needs of the British/European/global security of 2025. And the enemy in question here has to be either like Russia or China, not Germany. But I do think the security at the Seven Dials Club has to be better than it is here. I mean, same thing with the likes of like Wyvern Abbey, where a bunch of important government people are staying. It's like there definitely is like security guards and I don't know, like whatever the British Secret Service is or cameras. But because someone like Jimmy Thesiger is sort of involved, I don't think this is like too big of an issue. I think it may be at the end where like he throws the plans out to Lorraine, who's just like wandering around the grounds. That maybe that's a bit, unbelievable. But again, it's an adventure thriller. You can stretch your mind to hear a little bit more. There is, someone on the inside to get around these things. And though I think, like, I would hope, like, someone like Bill Eversley in 2025 would be someone, like, much more responsible and diligent than in 1929. Then again, we know government officials aren't all that bright or careful today, so maybe not. But I still think overall this plot works. Now, on to our first traditional mystery for this video. We have the Sittaford Mystery, and this one was pretty tough for me. I mean, the Sittaford Mystery has so many moving parts, and it has a few that I don't think work, but I debated if they didn't work enough to say this novel doesn't work. And for me, the biggest issue was the blizzard. In 2025, we are much better prepared for snow. We have better vehicles to drive through the snow. We have plows to clean up the snow. I'm not sure a blizzard like the one depicted in the novel like secludes and sets up the scene in a way that allows for Major Burnaby to murder Captain Trevelyan in 2025. I think there's a better chance the road is cleared or just simply like blocked off in a way to prevent passage. Remember, Burnaby is on skis. One of the things that keeps this mystery going in the novel is that because of the blizzard, everyone is like stuck inside. But in 2025, there are so many activities in the snow that I don't think Major Burnaby has the road to himself to avoid being seen on skis. And even if he does, I think skiing is just much more prevalent activity that someone would probably realize much sooner what actually had to have happened. And we do have better technology to determine when Trevelyan was murdered, although I don't think that matters too much here. The other issue is the motivation. I'm not sure in 2025 if Captain Trevelyan would use someone else's address for a sweepstakes contest. I understand why he does this in the novel, but I also think in 2025 that doesn't matter, and it also potentially violates the rules of the contest. I also don't think the contest organizers are mailing like 5,000 pound checks through the post anymore. This is definitely like a direct deposit with all kinds of rules, or, they're showing up to his door with like a giant novelty check. By the way, 5,000 pounds in 1931 is over 290,000 pounds in 2025, or in the US equivalent, $389,000. That also seems a very large sum for a newspaper soccer tournament, although perhaps this could be changed to some other kind of tournament. But I do feel like Trevelyan wouldn't have lied about his name and his address today, which is why I ultimately decided this wouldn't work in 2025. Maybe Charles Enderby isn't a reporter from a newspaper. Maybe he's like the British Mr. Beast, or someone who has large amounts of money to dole out for no reason. By the way, his newspaper is called the Daily Wire, which in 1931 was fictional, but today is an American far right news empire, so that name would have to be changed. It's not that I think this plot of the Sittaford Mystery is impossible, but I think just too many things are working against it for it to work properly. If there was just like one or two, maybe, but there's quite a few. Now, I think the seance works just fine. People will always believe in the supernatural. I think all the subplots with like the Darings and the Pearsons, they're all fine. Emily Trefusis and Charles Enderby are still their delightful selves. The subplot with the Willets is a bit weird. Like, I think they're taking a tremendous risk in 2025, given like how easily their identity could be found out. But I don't think that's necessarily a big deal. Something interesting here is that Dartmoor Prison temporarily closed in 2024 for renovation, I believe, which I think makes this plot, of their father escaping from there a lot easier to pull off, actually, as he could have escaped during, when inmates are transferred out of Dartmoor. But I think looking at the main mystery plot, I think there are enough issues for me to say this would not work in 2025. Next up is Why Didn't They Ask Evans? And this was also tough, mainly because we have impersonations going on. And these impersonations are also very much part of the setup, which makes it harder to ignore. People are presenting themselves as other people in court, which is strange. Now, I think this can be explained in that, Frankie and Bobby are amateurs and are a little naive. So I think some of the issues are covered quite convincingly simply by that. I think especially, with Moira being the girl in the photo is something that can scrape by, even if it might not seem so on first glance. And I could imagine someone like our victim here would actually have a photograph and not like a photo on his phone. Mechanics-wise, I think it all works. So I did say yes, this novel is possible in 2025. To be honest, I'm not so certain about it as I am with the others, but I think this being sort of like an adventure and having amateur sleuths does go a long way to making it happen. I don't see anything that really prevents this from happening. but maybe like Evans could be tracked a lot easier. But then again, it's not the police doing this work, it's Bobby and Frankie who are, and they don't have a lot of the same resources the police do. There's a lot of like lucky breaks in the novel that I think also go a long way here. In terms of the murder, I think like the body on the golf course is the same. Now, Bobby could just call the police on his cell phone, but it's at the bottom of a ditch, so maybe there's no reception there, and he also has to leave to go to church choir practice anyway, so I don't think it's necessarily something eliminated by technology. I think everything with like the Bassington Frenches works just fine. I don't know if someone like Badger is going to be like falling through roofs or anything in 2025, but I do largely think this plot is possible. Onto Murder is Easy, and this is another one with a lot of moving parts that I think makes things difficult to truly discern. Because on first glance, I thought this would work easily. But the more I thought about it, the more I did question that initial guess. Because the thing is, the plot is largely set off because Miss Pinkerton goes to Scotland Yard to tell them what's happening in Witchwood under Ash. But in 2025, like, does she actually go all the way to Scotland Yard? Like, wouldn't she call them on the phone? Could she send an email or something? I don't know. I think you could argue she can't do that because she lives with Miss Wainfleet, who might overhear, and she's an old lady who would, like, rather go to the place in person. I can buy that premise for sure. It's not like totally convincing, but I could buy it and accept it. I think Miss Wainfleet's motivation and the way she goes about committing the murders to incriminate Gordon Whitfield still works. I think someone like Gordon Whitfield in 2025 is probably even more susceptible to a god complex, similar to how I felt about Alistair Blunt. So I think that all works. Now, this is a funny one because the murder mechanics don't actually matter here. They are fun and crucial for the novel, but if Miss Wainfleet murders these people in different manners, it doesn't change the story much at all. I like the murders in the novel as I found them fun, and there are also some very clever ones, and there are clues there, but I don't think they have to remain the same for the book to remain the same in 2025. Like, the hat paint murder is already old-fashioned in 1939, and it's supposed to be, but I have no idea where one finds hat paint nowadays, so that would have to be changed. I also think in 2025, there's probably no reason for Dr. Humblebee to die from an infected wound with better treatment we have for that nowadays. Although I do love that murder. That's one of my favorite murders in Christie. That's the one where Miss Wainfleet infects the bandage with her cat's ear pus, which is really gross. So I do think Murder is Easy is something that's still possible in 2025, but the murders probably look different. But overall, the story is still something that can happen. Remember, I'm going to skip and then there were none. That has its own video. So next up is N or M, and this is not doable. This is a World War II set novel. It's not even post-war. It's set during the war. And there's just no equivalent of this Christie could use in 2025 to evoke the same setting, the same themes, the same plot. I suppose you could send Tommy and Tuppence abroad to like Ukraine or Israel or Palestine, but I think that just changes too much because this novel is about defending and protecting the British homeland. It just would not have the same potency if Christie sent the Beresfords to another country. And I cannot believe she would just like invent a fictional bombing of Britain akin to the Blitz. And even if she did, she's getting way too much into like dystopian literature. So I don't feel the need to investigate the mechanics of NRM because, just the change in time is enough. It's too much for this novel to overcome. It would be too different in tone and feeling, but I take a little look anyway. I actually do think mechanics-wise this book could work. Yes, messages are transmitted differently, but I think that's still fine. I think absolutely you could find someone like Wanda Polonska who loses her child to a British woman. We know like the Russians, for instance, have been kidnapping Ukrainian children and raising them Russian, but I just still don't think any of this matters because the change in setting time is just too different to even consider this book to work. Onto another traditional murder mystery with Towards Zero. And I think this works. I mean, good luck to Christie publishing a manifesto about how the publishing industry doesn't understand murder mysteries in 2025, especially because the publishing industry doesn't. Also, good luck trying to publish a murder mystery where the murder isn't in the first chapter, because some publishers don't like that. But I could totally see Christie doing this anyway. Like, she would not care. But plot wise, I think this works. The mechanics of the murder are a bit convoluted, and since the novel's clue lay largely in its characters, I think this still works. Now, I think in 2025, people aren't really paying all that much attention to each other. They're kind of aloof. Like, I don't know if some of these characters would have the same moments in their lives. All of these characters have that moment from their past that comes back and affects the present day. That seems like something a lot of people just like wouldn't pick up on nowadays. I don't know if someone like even Battle would recognize the look on Audrey's face being the same as the look on his daughter's face. You know, in this world of short attention spans, that seems like a bit of a stretch, but it's Christie. She would make it happen. And I think Neville's murder plots are considerably riskier. I think he could easily be seen and photographed climbing like up the side of the cliff, especially during the Mr. Treves murder, where he has to change the hotel, the out of order sign on the elevator. That hotel definitely has cameras, at least on the outside, if not on the inside in the lobby. Like, he would definitely be caught doing that. But, you know, all of these things I did not find to be disqualifying for Towards Zero, especially when Christie is writing this. Like, she would have little tweaks here that I would think would leave the novel largely intact and work just fine. And this is sort of a weird one. We have Death Comes as the End, and like N or M, I mean, the time setting is just too different to work. Yeah, this is a hard no. And this is also sort of weird because it's a historical mystery anyway. So if Christie wrote this book in 2025, it would be the same. Like, she would set it in ancient Egypt. So I guess on that front, this book would work. But I mean, no way the plot would actually work in 2025. Like, even ignoring the ancient Egyptian setting, this plot can't work. It's too ingrained in ancient Egyptian society. And Egyptians in 2025 do not live this way. It's not possible. There's no point at all in going through the plot because nothing outside of the motive actually would work in 2025 because Egyptian society is not set up today in this way that would allow any of this plot to work and function in the way it does. Onto Sparkling Cyanide, and this one has some issues. First of all, there is an impersonation going on, which I find somewhat implausible in 2025, but Victor Drake isn't particularly well known to people in the area, so I don't think that's necessarily a deal breaker. I do have issues with the way the murders happen. Again, I've talked about this before, but there's a huge plot hole. But again, I'm not considering plot holes in the shift in time. I'm only considering what the shift in time would mean for the novel. But still, I think in a restaurant, especially at a birthday party, people are on their phones. They're taking videos, they're taking photos. Everyone in the restaurant is doing this, especially at a place like the Luxembourg, which is a party restaurant, and it's very crowded too. Now, I think Pedro Morales's, in air quotes, date probably spends his absence on her phone, so maybe she's not looking as closely, but I think it's very unlikely that both Victor and Ruth go unspotted on both occasions they committed murder here. So for that reason, I don't think this one works. And there are little other things as well. I actually find some of the character backstories to be a little old fashioned in a way I don't think would happen in 2025. I mean, for instance, the circumstances regarding Rosemary's inheritance and Mrs. Drake's situation all seem just like unlikely to happen today. Not completely so, it's not impossible, but unlikely. But I do think like the Faradays are still great characters and they really wouldn't need to change much. Maybe Stephen isn't so concerned about a scandal, but I don't think that would be the case with him. And I think my saying this novel wouldn't work might have been a bit unexpected, but I just think the basic premise of the murder plot just can't work today. I mean, the risk of being seen and captured on video is way too high here in a very crowded restaurant where people are celebrating birthdays and anniversaries or whatever have you. And it also involves an impersonation, which I think also harms it. I also think the setup is sort of weird. I mean, Ruth Lessing is sort of enamored by Victor Drake because she had to go see him in person to give him the money. In 2025, they just transfer funds from the bank. She doesn't have to go see him off or whatever. So I just think even in the setup here is unlikely to work. I don't think Ruth Lessing would fall for Victor Drake in 2025, which is also a big issue. On to Crooked House, and I think this one would work in 2025. Now, I think the change in time setting negatively affects the quality of this novel because we're out of World War II now. That's why the Leonides are living together, is because of the war. So I think the background information just isn't as strong today, but I'm not assessing the quality of the novel, just if the plot would work, and I think it does. Now, I guess you could say because we're not in the post-war period, the financial issues just aren't as prominent, but I mean, in 2025, we're in a post-COVID world, and the family business was catering, which certainly suffered during COVID, and in the book, anyway, the company is being mismanaged, so still, there's financial issues afoot. And the method of murder still works. They do still make Esserine eye drops, although I suspect Aristide probably would have gotten like LASIK surgery for its cataracts, but he would still need the eye drops. This is another one with a bit of a plot hole. I mean, the Esserine injected into him wouldn't be enough to kill him, but again, that's not the point for this video. I still see Josephine as a likely murderer. I suppose by 2025, a child murderer isn't as shocking as it was in 1945, but Christie wasn't going for the shocking factor when she wrote this book. I actually wondered if in 2025, if Josephine doesn't have some kind of like secret YouTube channel or online blog where she details her crimes instead of her notebook, but no one sees it, doesn't get any views, so it just goes largely unsuspected. She's very smart, but also naive enough to do something like that. I do think the family dynamics still work, although I suspect they probably don't live together like they do in the actual novel. And Lawrence Brown is a little interesting here. There's no war for him to object to. I mean, there are, but not like World War II. So I think the effects of his character are a bit different. I do get the sense that Crooked House in 2025 wouldn't nearly be as good as it is in real life, but it could still happen. It's still plausible this would happen. They came to Baghdad, and I don't know, I guess it works. This is one of those lackluster, ridiculous thrillers that probably does work because they're not totally credible to begin with. If I made this video first, I might have actually have said no, given the state of Baghdad in 2025, but one of you told me the Middle East, and including Baghdad, isn't actually all that dangerous anymore, so, though maybe the plot would work better with the danger, I don't know. I don't want to spend too much time on this novel because first of all, I don't really care about it. But I think the central premise works of Victoria Jones coming across like the murdered spy and her subsequent adventures in the Middle East. It requires a lot of suspension of belief, but I mean, so does the original. So I think this works in 2025. To be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on the details of this book. It's not one I reread that often or think about ever, but I don't think there's anything here that like doesn't work. And the same thing with Destination Unknown. I guess this works. Now, you can just substitute Russia for the Soviet Union here. This plot is a little dystopian as it is, and the idea of this like fake leper colony in the mountains of Morocco is just too ridiculous for words. Although I guess there's a lot worse, with modern technology. Like, I could see this being more realistic in 2025, but again, it doesn't matter. The plot of this is just too bizarre. It would work because the time is meaningless here. It doesn't matter. Now, I do find Hilary Craven to be a character who I actually think would work better in 2025, much more so than Victoria Jones, so that's something. I actually think Destination Unknown could be quite a bit of fun in 2025. I would still have little interest in it, and I also think this type of plot of 2025 might stray far away from like the more mystery adventure thriller into a more dystopian, almost sci-fi work. But again, I still think the plot could work. Ordeal by Innocence, and this is another one that I think is still possible for sure, although the change in setting does negatively affect the quality, much like it did with Crooked House. I actually almost said no here, this isn't possible, but I did change my mind. The murder of Rachel Argyle and Philip Durant are fine, mechanics wise. They aren't complex, so they just work the same way. Same thing with the attempted murder of Tina. The reason why I almost said no is because I think in 2025, Jacko would be able to establish an alibi much easier than the way he did, or failed to do actually, in 1958. He could just record himself in a video someplace else at that time to prove he wasn't, at Sunny Point to murder his mother. You have to remember, he know when Kristen was going to kill Rachel, and he needs to be able to prove he wasn't there at the time, which is much easier to do. And especially a young man like Jacko, would use technology and not hoping to be picked up by like a random stranger. So I do think that part is a bit sketchy, although I suppose this could still happen. There's nothing that like precludes it from happening. And I think a major reason why I don't think this book would be as good in 2025 is the backstory of the Argyle children and how some of them were adopted by Rachel during the Blitz. There is no Blitz in around 2010 or so, but still, there's always something going on in the world, and Rachel could just adopt them from different countries, or she doesn't really need an earth-shattering event to adopt children. However, in 2025, hopefully there wouldn't be all that weird adoption stuff. I also think in 2025, Jacko probably doesn't die in prison. Prison conditions are much better nowadays, and I don't know how a living but imprisoned Jacko affects the plot. It's also potential that he gets released during the course of the novel, but overall, I think this plot is still very doable. I'm still iffy on Jacko's alibi, but the thing is, there were better ways for him to establish an alibi in 1958 than what he did anyway, so maybe he would make the same mistake in 2025. Next up is The Pale Horse, and I was really up in the air with this one. It's just so unusual of a plot that I really didn't know. I don't see a reason why the Pale Horse operation couldn't operate in the way it does in 1961 today. In fact, we have all kinds of like secretive communication methods and apps and whatnot. It's not like there aren't illegal operations going on today no one knows about. So I think all of that checks out. I mean, what's more questionable to me is the way Zachariah Osborne and his associates commit the murders. I don't know anyone who answers random surveys from people either like over the phone or in person, as is done in the novel. And when someone unexpected knocks on my door, I run and hide because I have no interest in answering it. And that's a very common sentiment. No one has time or interest in long surveys from random people, especially about like what healthcare products they use and what cosmetics they use, etc. So I think that part of the operation doesn't work. However, I still think it's very easy to discover this information. People reveal way too much information about themselves online, and there are beauty influencers like crawling around all over the place. What their influence is, I have no idea, but they exist. And I could easily see someone like Thomasina Tuckerton being a beauty influencer. Osborne could so easily just like hack into victims' computers to find out what products they may have purchased. And to be honest, I never really understood why Osborne had these like unsuspecting women go door to door with these surveys. Like, it didn't seem to make any sense when Osborne could have just, gotten that information from like the person who's paying for the murder to happen, or just simply like break into their apartments or their flats or their houses and poison the products they have there. Like, I don't understand the need for all these like extra steps, but I do think this is still very possible. So I said yes, the Pale Horse would still work in 2025. I still think there are a few hitches. Like, I do wonder if like thallium poisoning might not be easier to diagnose today if one of these poison victims went to the hospital. Now, on the other hand, the Pale Horse is responsible for people recognizing the symptoms of thallium poisoning, so maybe in this universe, no one knows about thallium poisoning yet. Like, I don't know if it will come up on a blood test if you're not looking for it specifically. And I do question that, the actual Pale Horse in stuff, as that seems very weird, but that's just mostly a front, and everyone kind of knows it anyway. So I do think the Pale Horse would work in 2025. Although, the inspiration here for Dr. Osborne is a real life doctor that Christie worked with in World War One. In a universe where Christie is just still writing in 2025, she didn't serve as a nurse or in the poison dispensaries of World War One. Though, again, that's getting really, I think, too into the weeds here for this video, so I'll just leave it alone. On to Endless Night, and I think this one very easily works in 2025. There really isn't a lot here that is time dependent. I do find all the stuff with Esther Lee, the gypsy, to be a little odd for today. I mean, the supernatural and people believing in that is one thing, but this is probably a step too far, but also this doesn't really serve any like practical purpose other than to establish like the spooky atmosphere and the tone of the novel. So I think it's fine to include the word gypsy, again, sort of gone out of style nowadays, especially for someone who is not, of that ethnicity. But the actual murder mechanics of this novel are very simple, so it all works. And what makes Endless Night the last not good novel Christie wrote is the way she tells the story. So the storytelling doesn't change. There's very little in this book that actually has to be assessed for the purposes of this video. I mean, the one thing that gives me a little hesitation is the Claudia Hardcastle murder, which happened because she took a random pill she found in the woods, which is very strange, but also very strange for 1967 as well. And that can just easily be gotten around by having Ellie give her the pill. But the love triangle of Michael, Ellie, Greta is a timeless classic that transcends the decades. And Michael's murderous tendencies is such a classic as well. Like, definitely Michael Rogers is a villain of like a Lifetime movie in 2025 or like a Netflix crime show like You or something like that. In many ways, I do think Michael Rogers is a character very well suited for today, especially with his lack of career. I mean, he's essentially in the gig economy before there ever was one. So I actually do think this works pretty well today. We have By the Pricking of My Thumbs up next, and this is another like really strange one. The thing is, Mrs. Lancaster's sort of mental decline began when she was in this like Bonnie and Clyde like situation, which I just think is highly unlikely to happen to her, in what would be like the 1960s or 70s. This was also started by her having an illegal abortion, with abortion being mostly legal in the UK in 1967. So there's a little conflict there. I suppose like the cutoff year could still work. And I also think in 2025, Christie probably would just want to avoid talking about abortion, although altogether, especially in the way she does in this novel. So I did decide By the Pricking of My Thumbs was not possible in 2025, and it wasn't just because of Mrs. Lancaster's backstory. There are other things as well. I mean, the nursing home situation is very off here. I don't think nursing homes are all that great now, but certainly they have all kinds of regulations that I think make Mrs. Lancaster's living situation just very difficult to pull off. I think because she constantly gets moved around after she causes trouble, that's going to be a bit of a red flag. And some of the things in her criminal gang was doing just like not credible nowadays, or at the time these events would have happened. There's also a lot better ways in like 2025 for Sir Philip Starr to cover up Mrs. Lancaster's crimes in this current plan he's doing. As for Tommy and Tuppence, I think that everything they do still works. Their investigation doesn't have any real problems that I can see. I mean, perhaps their attitude is a bit different, but there's too many things to go wrong here. So I said, By the Pricking of My Thumbs wouldn't work in 2025. Passenger to Frankfurt, and this is another like bizarre adventure thriller that I think works. I mean, just again because it's not particularly credible anyway in 1970, so why not in 2025? Now, I actually do think this one has some issues that maybe prevent it from working, but I decided against that. I find it just so unlikely someone could be drugged in the Frankfurt airport. Then again, it happens consensually, so maybe that doesn't matter. I haven't been to the Frankfurt airport, so I don't really know how that would work, but it just seems so ridiculous. And the place where all the Hitlers live is just so silly. I actually think that still works. I know in the book it's supposed to be more profound because Hitler could have had a son, or maybe he was still alive in Argentina somewhere. And because the book is set much closer to 2025, I mean, it's set much closer to World War II than 2025 is. It doesn't like hold the same water. I mean, obviously Hitler could not still be alive in 2025, even if he did escape to South America. But I think Hitler is someone who is still well known, who is still in some ways influencing our society today. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of like Nazis and neo-Nazis around in various degrees. So I actually think the plot here could still work very well, actually. People still openly praise Hitler at times, which is sad and scary. And someone like Christie just is not going to like sit back and let that happen. And overall, this plot is just so silly. It's completely ungrounded. It often doesn't make sense. So I don't see why it wouldn't work today. And last and certainly least, we have Postern of Fate, which, I mean, I have no idea. I really couldn't even tell you what this book was about. I suppose it's possible, since nothing is really going on here. I mean, it's hard to argue there is something that doesn't work in 2025. So I guess this works. I mean, if Tommy and Tuppence find like a coded message about a spy being murdered 60 years prior, that would be about 1965. Like, I don't understand why this wouldn't be able to work as a story. I mean, maybe some of the mechanics, as little mechanics as there are, would have to be changed. Like, I don't know why Iris Mullins would care in 2025, and I don't know why she cared in 1973. I do think maybe her murdering Isaac is a bit of an issue, since she murders him on the Beresford's front porch in broad daylight, but again, that didn't seem to be an issue in 1973. I just have so little to say here other than, I guess this works, sure, why not? And that is it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you think about my suggestions here, and if you disagree, let me know why. And this was a very fun exercise. This actually finishes up all of the Christie novels, and I'm going to continue with this series in the future. Definitely do like short stories and books from other authors. Like, I usually only do these type of videos for Christie because she's the most well known, and a lot of people don't know the other books, so there's really no point in covering like Rex Stout or something. But I think for the purpose of this exercise, I enjoyed this a lot, and I suspect a lot of you did as well. So I'll definitely keep it going forward. I don't know exactly when the next episode will be. Probably, I'll probably do like Poirot short stories, probably like Poirot Investigates or Labors of Hercules, something like that. But again, that'll be in the future sometime. But next week, I'm moving on to a review of an Ellery Queen novel, one of my very favorite Ellery Queen novels, The Murderer is a Fox, which is set in the aftermath of World War II. And I've heard from some of you when I recommended this book that you also really enjoyed this book, which makes me very happy to hear. So stay tuned for my review of this book next week. Until next time, Mystery Files.